I'll just let a couple more people in. Fantastic. Okay. So we're absolutely delighted to welcome today Thomas Moser. Thomas is Universitätsassistent and lecturer at the Vienna University of Technology and a PhD candidate in History of Art at the Ludwig Maximillian University of Munich. He's also currently, and I don't know how you have the energy, Thomas, he's an occasional student at the Warburg Institute in London and is lecturing at the Catholic University of Eichstätt-Ingolstadt, and I apologise for my German pronunciation. He studied art history, philosophy, and architecture in Munich, Paris, and Vienna, held a fellowship at the DFG research group Imaginaries Force at the University of Hamburg, and was visiting researcher at the Centre allemand d'Histoire de l'Art in Paris. His PhD thesis is titled Body and Object, Experiences of Force and Touch in the Decorative Arts and Natural Sciences around 1900, and it received perennial funding from the German National Academic Foundation and the Gerda-Henkel Foundation. He's published work on Art Nouveau objects and architecture, bodily modes of art appreciation around the turn of the century, as well as art theory in early 20th century and post-war Germany. His wider research interests focus on European modernism, object studies in art history, the body and the senses in the arts, and the entanglement of arts and the natural sciences. So Thomas, a very warm welcome to you. And if you want to start sharing your screen and begin, over to you.
Thank you. First of all, I will share my screen. So this should work and you should see my slides now. First of all, thanks so much for this very kind introduction that I always feel like I can hardly live up to, all those things. Also, I want to thank the organizer for the really great opportunity to present a part of my research to you. Today, I'm really thrilled to be here this evening. What I'm about to present to you today is not actually part of my PhD thesis, but it does share with it the key interest in the link between Art Nouveau decorative arts and the natural sciences. As this is obviously an essay in the making, and as I'm still figuring out all the historical specificities of the subject, I'll not only very much welcome questions, but if not foremost, also comments, hints, suggestions, and recommendations of any kind. And I can only encourage all of you to provide me with any help that you can offer. Finally, in terms of structure, the idea is to show you a rather representative handful of objects from Émile Gallé and some of his fellow artists in Nancy at the very beginning of my presentation, and then spend the major part of my talk on cultural, philosophical, and notably scientific context in order to eventually making sense of the design and constitution of the aforementioned objects at the end. Depending on how nervous I'll stay during my talk, my presentation will take something roughly between like 35 and 40 minutes, something like that. So I hope it is manageable. So, the aim of this presentation is to provide arguments in favor of a probably false assertion. Said assertion originates from Alistair Duncan, who had been working as a consultant for Christie's since 1977 and was later adopted by the British art dealer and Art Nouveau expert Victor Orwas. He obviously adopted the assertion, not Duncan. This is the second slide. Commenting on Alphonse Mucha's sculptural work in an exhibition catalog, Orwas casually notes for the spectacular bronze bust La Nature from 1899 that the gemstone mounting on top of the personification had initially been intended for a light bulb. So that's the green one you can see here. A glance at Mucha's zodiac lithograph that you see on the right from 3 years earlier already reveals this assumption to be rather unlikely. The archaic headdress of the astrological personification in profile view corresponds to that of La Nature in terms of form as well as in terms of ornamentation. Given that the richly decorated crown of the zodiac has been translated into the bronze, the original use of the nature as an electric lamp seems rather far-fetched. Since both crowns feature oval gems set into sockets at the top, a conceptual modification by Moser is merely speculative and fairly improbable. In the following, however, the point is not to criticize Duncan's hypothesis, but rather to consider it as an inducement to ponder the relationship of Art Nouveau electric lamps and nature. Hence, the immediate question arises as to why, of all things, a prominently placed light bulb should have adorned a personification of nature. As today, electric light is hardly associated with verdant meadows, forests, and havens of nature, but in lieu thereof with power plants and overpriced electricity bills. In other words, it is perceived as a veritable counterpart to a romanticized notion of nature. Yet in the Belle Époque, that is around 1900, the popular notion of nature and above all electricity was somewhat different. In this regard, the electric table lamps from the milieu of the École de Nancy seem especially striking. On the one hand, this is because they are characterized by the haptic plasticity of their botanical motifs, and on the other hand, because in this case, the plant life is not merely a decorative ornament, but constituting the object itself. Instead of lamps, one should face, for instance, magnolias, prickly pears, and in Émile's case, even a mushroom that you can see here on the right-hand side. Also, unlike other art objects, the biomorphic lamps appear as particularly vivid because they produce and emit light themselves. The electrical light generated by the lamp thus acts as a sensually perceptible, seemingly natural force. The invisible creation of light was thoughtfully regulated through the employment of glass, which the École de Nancy processed with exceptional skill. Thanks to the glass part's usually frosted surface finish, the light source is not only slightly dimmed, but also the technical light bulb is withdrawn from the viewer's gaze. The electrical wiring runs like delicate veins through the stems, endowing the vegetal object organism with vitality. Some lamps by Louis Majorel and the Dome factory render the lamp's invigorating current quite explicit. In the case of the oleander lamp that you see in the middle, and even more so in that of the eucalyptus lamp on the right, a number of light bulbs are installed inside the lamp base, in addition to the ones beneath the shade. Gleaming from behind the floral motifs, these sources' subdued light suggests an energetic infusion of the entire ornamental flora. At the same time, the light bulb, which has finally become utilizable in private homes in the 1880s, was regarded as a technological revolution. So why was this high-tech product designed as organic nature? The following considerations will argue that the identity of electric light and the forces of nature was around 1900 self-evident and moreover deeply rooted in natural philosophy. The group of vegetal lamps I present in the study belong to an area of Art Nouveau visual culture that has been widely neglected by art history so far. Precisely because of their object qualities, they emerge as electrically animated organisms embodying a biological conception of electricity. The first part is entitled The Triumph of Electricity in 1900. In his view back on the turn of the century, French writer Premodern described the widespread use of electricity in everyday life in terms of a collective obsession. Electricity was gathered, condensed, transformed, bottled, stretched into wires, wound into coils, then discharged underwater, on fountains, emancipated on roofs, and unleashed in trees, Moran writes. Anything that could possibly be carried out using electricity was now to be done electrically. Transportation and industry, as well as domestic private life, underwent nothing less than a technological revolution during these years, while the novelist's electrocentric visions of the future oscillated between utopias and dystopias alike. As for most innovations of the fin de siècle, the Paris World's Fair of 1900 retrospectively gives the impression of a large-scale rite de passage, ultimately establishing electricity's new omnipresence. In contrast to its predecessors, however, the technological inner workings of the exhibits at the 1900 World's Fair were increasingly concealed. Vis-à-vis the Eiffel Tower, which had served as the focal point at the 1889 World's Fair, the axis running from the Trocadero was concluded by the Electricity Palace on the Champ de Mars. The imposing iron and glass construction by Eugène Hénard protruded only a little beyond the preceding Château d'Eau, that is the moated castle or water castle, by Edmond Paulin. Well, you can see the water castle in the center, and behind it this glass and steel structure with the two chimneys. That's the Electricity Palace. Although designed in a joint process, the neo-Baroque so-called Belle Époque Versailles differed greatly in style from the modernist Electricity Palace. On the appearance of the Château d'Eau, the critic Julius Meyer-Graefe noted that a, quote, megalomaniacal pâtissier may dream of such architecture. In fact, the Grand Palais and the Petit Palais also drew on the fusion of iron, glass, and neo-Baroque decorum that was somewhat typical of the exhibition in total. Yet the moated castle and the Electricity Palace did not only form an architectural unit, as enormous steam lines inside the Electricity Palace powered the surrounding pavilions, requiring a correspondingly large volume of water. This was supplied directly from the Château d'Eau, which in turn was fed by the nearby river Seine. Together, both buildings allegedly consumed nearly 12,000 liters of water per second. Atop this powerhouse of the exhibition resided a sculptural so-called Fée électricité that would translate into spirit or genius of electricity. Until the 1920s, female allegories of electricity were used to promote optimism towards the technological progress prevailing in the new century. The personification crowning the Electricity Palace was flanked by two genii, I really don't know how to pronounce that, two geniuses, in the guise of a Pegasus and a complementary demonic bat-winged horse. The iconography of Pegasus had a double meaning here. Firstly, the beat of his hoof is supposed to have created the helioconic spring, represented by the Château d'Eau's opulent play of light and water. Secondly, it was Pegasus who conferred lightning and thunder to Zeus, the father of the gods. This Olympic lightning bolt was held in the right hand of the female allegory, emitting spectacular Tesla sparks. Naturally, the iconography applied to the entire ensemble formed by the Electricity Palace and the Château d'Eau. Even more impressively, electricity was visualized by the large steel or iron construction behind the group, a multi-pronged three-dimensional rod structure in the shape of a star. Although it was presumably the star itself that had to be illuminated, its graphic reproductions, it is commonly the star-shaped figure that illuminates the Mars field like an oversized lamp. And this also applies to the entire ensemble again, which was lit up at night by more than 5,000 colored light bulbs, 8 monumental spotlights, and numerous lanterns. 9 huge translucent glass bays of the Château d'Eau also contributed to this effect. And additionally, electric light placed underneath several gargoyles was directed via mirrors in such a way that the water jets were lit from the inside as they emerged from their mouths. Obviously, the abundant display combines the elements of light and water as sources of life. In the evening hours, the oversized public lamp installation of glass must have been visible already from a very great distance. Even the opposing Eiffel Tower, now a symbol of the past century, was irradiated by countless frosted lamps, which were equally furnished by the Electricity Palace. The exhibition's central structure clearly indicates that both in terms of iconography and power supply, light and electric illumination were not understood as mere symptoms of electrification. Instead, they were conceived as an essential aspect of electricity as a groundbreaking precursor of a double sense of the word, bright future. At the same time, the electrified future did not lack an aesthetic potential. In his review of the 1891 electrical exhibition in Frankfurt am Main, the Austrian journalist Émile Peschkau attested electricity a certain quality that he termed the so-called poetry of science. According to Peschkau, this is not solely expressed in the fact that, as part of the exhibition, a ballet on Galvani's discovery of animal electricity was performed, but also in the machines seemingly brought to life. Analogous to the human body, they featured bodies and human eyes that observed the visitors. In this animistic manner, the art historian Alfred Meyer has emphasized the natural affinity linking electrical engineering and the applied arts. Following Meyer, I quote, oh, this is a wrong slide. This will come later on. Following Meyer, the quote, colossal organism of power machine derives from the very impulse that inspired the idea of the potter's wheel in prehistoric times. And the finest creation of modern decorative art still remains well within the evolution of the same sense of ornamentation found in the savage's hut as a raw color stroke, end quote. Biologistic rhetoric about machines had become so commonplace in the course of the 19th century. Yet an encyclopedic distinction was made between the conception of man as an engine and biomorphic images of machines. Victor Hugo lamented in his poem Melancholia already in the mid-1850s that the animation of machinery came at the expense of man. Louis Proudhon and the English art critic John Ruskin considered modern industry to be increasingly incompatible with the arts, as modern units no longer held any aesthetic value. The main reason being, interestingly enough, the invisibility of the engines. In Jean-Marie Guyot's physiological vital force aesthetics from the 1880s, by contrast, the animation of machines is elevated to the aesthetic agenda. The machine that resembles best a living being, an être vivant, will always be the most beautiful, Guyot states. The industrial striving for as energy and efficient units as possible would render them more and more akin to living organisms. In this context, life and movement are interchangeable, since the monstrous machines would only be alive, and that is beautiful, as long as they remained in motion. The resulting poetic beauty of the modern apparatuses resembles Peschkau's equally motion-centered poetry of science. Throughout the course of his eloquent account, this is Peschkau's account, his ekphrasis turns into what resembles a feverish Art Nouveau dream. And now here comes the quotation. In amazement, we stand before the tendrils of leaves and blossoms, which appear to be nature and yet remain gold and silver. And as we approach, we witness the electric current as it ghostly flows along the panels of precious metal, dissolving and carrying away the fine particles to cover natural roses and mayflowers, ivy winds, and palm fronds. And suddenly, a dark room begins to light up, and all the colors start to glow before our eyes. Again, flowering tendrils, but they are now gleaming. We are facing the wonders of electric light, end quote. As you see there on the lower part, this is the original quote. From an aesthetic point of view, organic life and technology do not seem to be diametrically opposed. It is striking that although Peschkau maintains a certain tension between metal bodies and floral jumble, the tension does not exist between the electric light and the botanical organisms it engenders. The reason for this at first glance surprising homogeneity can be traced back to the most fundamental discovery of the 19th century physics, namely thermodynamics. The nature of electricity. After Julius von Meyer had shown as early as 1842 that kinetic energy can be converted into thermal energy, apparently without loss, Hermann von Helmholtz expanded this idea in his 1847 paper über die Erhaltung der Kraft, that is, on the conservation of force. Helmholtz's contribution popularized the theory and incorporated electricity in addition to mechanical, chemical, and thermal energy. Although severe limitations had to be conceded since the acknowledgement of entropy in the 1860s, the general transformability of each of these energies into one another was set in stone. The landslide consequences not only put vitalist positions in their places, but they also established a new kind of mechanistic worldview that no longer had to distinguish between different energies and ultimately between man and machine. Nevertheless, among the forces of nature, electricity consistently appears as prima inter pares. Influenced by the debate on the so-called vital force or Lebenskraft in the second half of the 18th century, electricity was still suspected to be the primal driving force of organic life. The metaphysical, natural philosophy of Romanticism believed to have found in it, in electricity, what Goethe called the world soul, die Weltseele. In literature, this connection is famously evident, for instance, in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. With the increasing rejection of vitalist stances around mid-century, electricity was then reinterpreted from a metaphysical into a quantifiable physical entity applicable in countless areas of modern life. Nevertheless, its vitalist connotation still resonated. Up to the fin de siècle, it was assumed that electricity would positively affect the human organism. The body was conceived of as a thermodynamic machine, as a human motor in which metabolic processes could be economized in favor of measurable labor. As Anson Rabenbach has shown in great detail, it was hoped at the time that electricity would be the ultimate antidote to the physical exhaustion and fatigue of factory workers. Meanwhile, in agriculture, the extent to which electricity could be used as some sort of galvanic fertilizer to grow vegetables of superior quality was investigated. However, the most significant and enduring impact of the vitalist electro-euphoria fell, and you probably already guessed that, on medicine. Soon, electrotherapy became socially accepted, which celebrated as some sort of miracle cure ranged from continuous microdoses of galvanic baths to painful electric shocks. And here you see on the left a 1901 depiction of an electrotherapeutic treatment for tuberculosis. And on the right is an illustration from an encyclopedic dictionary from the 1890s. When reaching its temporary peak around 1900, electrotherapeutical treatment was deemed to be a medical universal remedy that was to find its way to the private sphere via a broad market of devices for domestic use. In the United States, the so-called Dr. Scott's electric hairbrush was praised to relieve headaches and fight hair loss, limb paralysis, and constipation. An electrically stimulating corset was said to provide the desired perfect physique for women, and male potency, on the other hand, was to be improved with the help of galvanic belts, being prominently referred to, by the way, in Gustave Flaubert's Madame Bovary. Naturally, the company Pulvermacher was quite famous in this regard, advertised with the slogan, "Electricity is life." In his proto-surrealist novel Le Surmal de Superman, Alfred Jarry caricatures the seemingly life-giving properties of electricity. In the grotesque hymn to the cult of physical strength during the fin de siècle, it is stated that an electric chair, of all things, makes those condemned to death appear as alive. And this is because electricity makes the lifeless bodies quiver and fidget in shock. Jarry thus pushes the coherence of movement and life to the absurd. Going back to Paschal, in his Poetology of Electrical Engineering, the thermodynamically impregnated worldview takes on the guise of physical energy conversion processes in a way more general approach. And I quote, "Today, the very workshop of nature is unlocked to us. We behold how matter, animated by force, is given form, and how, through the interaction of these forms, forces are released anew, and entirely novel forms are emerging. We can see the force of matter becoming attractive or repulsive, performing mechanical work and turning into heat, light, or sound, and above all, manifesting as electricity." End of quote. All things material are permeated here by a monistic, form-giving natural force experienced by the human senses as heat, light, and sound. Paschal's techno-romanticism makes it evident that the thermodynamically justified mechanization of organic life could just as well be turned vice versa into an animation of electrified technology. The autobiographical memoirs of the American historian Henry Adams give an impression of how far the vitalization of electricity was taken around 1900. In the book's chapter entitled The Dynamo and the Virgin, Adams reports on his visits to the 1900 Paris World's Fair and his utter bewilderment at the new ubiquity of the power of electricity. Somewhat surprisingly, for him, electricity resembles the spiritual power of faith, which he intentionally attributes exclusively to female beings. One more quote. Everyone, even among Puritans, knew that neither Diana of the Ephesians nor any of the Oriental goddesses was worshipped for her beauty. She was goddess because of her force. She was the animated dynamo. She was reproduction, the greatest and most mysterious of all energies. All she needed was to be fecund. Adams' equalization of electricity and the worship of femininity thus turns out to be some sort of thermodynamic Darwinism. He understands the reproductive instinct, supposedly omnipresent in nature, as the very driving force of faith. Ostensibly, according to the laws of thermodynamics, however, the force too ought to be transformable into electric power. When the urge to procreate and the effect of electric force are identical, for Adam, archaic female deities suddenly transformed into nothing more than anthropomorphic dynamos. His vitalist idea of a metaphysical reproductive energy does not seem to exclude its mechanistic convertibility into electricity. By the time the resilience of thermodynamics was culturally tested, the concept of electricity as vis vitalis was still not off the table. Acknowledging mechanistic premises, it rather seemed that electricity could have a vitalizing effect on both organic and now also technological beings. Electric light as vis vitalis. Particularly illustrative of electricity's vitalizing qualities was electric light, not least because it differed significantly from its predecessor, the gas light, and you see where this is obviously going. As much as the gas light had initially been celebrated, it was pretty much condemned by the middle of the 19th century. Noxious gases and the risk of explosions were only some of the severe issues of this technology, which was soon to be judged unsatisfactory. In his publication on artificial lighting and health from 1881, the British inventor Rue Crampton stated that people had grown accustomed to the fact that when taking the library ladder to get a book from the upper shelves, they found their heads, quote, plunged in a temperature like that of a furnace, producing giddiness and general malaise. The light generating capacity of electricity was already noticed around 1800, but due to the practical reasons, it was initially not usable for room lighting. Around the middle of the century, the carbon arc lamp was the first to use electric light on a larger scale. Yet arc light could only be utilized outdoors and in theaters because it proved impossible to regulate at the beginning, most plainly far too bright. For example, one single of these carbon arc lamps was sufficient for the operation of an entire lighthouse. As we all know, it was Thomas Edison who remedied the situation and made electric lighting in private homes feasible. Although the British physician Joseph Swan registered a patent for an electric light bulb as early as 1878, that is 2 years prior to Edison, its breakthrough only occurred when the American inventor and businessman Edison came up with the technical infrastructure for the new means of illumination. Even decades later, the cultural relevance of the invention was still repeatedly praised, so that Arthur Fürst wrote in 1926 that the incandescent bulb would remain one of the most noble devices ever created by human hands. In striking contrast to the scolded gas light, the odorless electric light was deemed far more natural, and this is key. Back in 1855, the Gazette de France had already granted it a remarkable quality in this respect. The surroundings of the Château de Beaujeu near Lyon had been illuminated in the evening hours by such a deluge of artificial sunlight that the birds had begun to sing again. In addition to the tremendous light intensity, the article also implies that even the animal world wasn't capable of distinguishing electric from natural sunlight. In fact, it was the first attempt by the engineers Joseph Lacassagne and Rodolphe Thiers at rendering the luminous arc light passable in public spaces. The analogy between electric light and sunlight remained a widespread motif during the fin de siècle. In numerous landscapes and botanical still lifes on domes glass lampshades, the electric light of the bulb therefore substitutes that of the sun. Electricity's claimed vitality becomes all the more obvious considering that as late as 1899, Ernst Haeckel, by the way, in accordance with Helmholtz, declared that all life on Earth is ultimately converted sunlight. At the 1900s World's Fair, the visual vocabulary exceeded a mere comparison with sunlight in line with the already noted liaison between electricity, light, and biology. As the contemporary author aptly named Heinrich Lux, that would translate into Henry Light, pointed out, people everywhere had become fully aware that electricity, out of all the forces of nature, played the key and most insistent role in all cultural life. In his almost 100-page review of engineering exhibits on the World's Fair, Lux employs a fitting metaphorical language. He refers to the red lanterns that hung like, quote, fruits in the branches on the field of Mars, and several roofs that only when illuminated by electric light, quote, glistened in a magnificent, radiant tendril architecture. With regard to the biologization of electric light, Morin went a bold step further when he summed up women were flowers, fleurs à ampoule, and flowers were bulbs. Flower with bulbs were women. So the disrespectful twist here lies in the fact that ampoule in French can denote both light bulb and a blister or callus. As with Adams, Morin thus suggested a connection between electrical productivity and female sexuality. So electrical lighting, human procreation, and biological life rhetorically fell into one. The entanglement of biology and electricity culminated in the World's Fair's key architectural ensemble next to the Eiffel Tower, consisting, as I already mentioned, of the Château d'Eau and the Palais d'Électricité. The Electricity Palace supplied the entire 112 hectares of exhibition space on the banks of the Seine with electricity. And for this reason, countless hymns of praise can be found, not just for the shared facade being brought to life by the lighting design, but also for the renderings of the Electricity Palace as the exhibition's vital organ and its very heart. In the official booklet, for instance, the one accompanying the exhibition, it is stated that the palace would provide the, quote, colossal organism with movement and light. As we've seen in the natural sciences of the Belle Epoque, both light and movement were synonymous with life itself. And as mentioned by Peschkau, the mechanical vital force which manifests as electricity was carried to the most remote corners of the exhibition via electric cables. Consequently, the anthropomorphization was not limited to the Electricity Palace itself, which represented the arena of the forces acting on the organs, but extended to the entire site. Without its, and I'm quoting again from the booklet, lifeblood, the exhibition would be nothing more than a motionless body lacking even the slightest breath of life. The driving force of life and form flaring up in electricity and grasped rather awkwardly by Adams corresponds to the procreative drive which Henri Bergson shortly afterwards defined as élan vital. On the last pages of his book entitled Évolution créatrice, the future Nobel Prize winner even refused to rule out that electricity could be the very foundation of all bodies. The table lamps from Nancy epitomize this vital potential of the electric current flowing through them in their visual vocabulary. The one known as lycoprin, that is the inky cap mushroom from the hand of the École de Nancy ringleader Émile Gallé, elegantly plays with this connection. Here, the smallest mushroom's phallic appearance references the vegetal reproductive instinct that had led to an exuberant sexualization of nature since Darwin, and this is rather Darwin's reception in the later 19th century than it is Darwin himself, actually. French art historian François Letacon has interpreted the different sizes of the mushrooms as representing the 3 ages of man. But this anthropomorphization cannot be conclusively convincing owing to the lack of the very characteristic droplet formation at the mushroom's head's edge. The growth force active in nature is nevertheless clearly addressed by the 3 stages of the fungi. The natural scientist artist Gallé held profound knowledge of evolutionary processes, as emphasized by many and really countless contemporaries, and most notably by the author Émile Nicolas in an extensive obituary. In Gallé's client's dining room, which had been designed as a forest, and this is where this object would belong eventually, the natural character of the electric light was to become even more striking. You can see it here from a presentation in the museum in Wiesbaden. The differing light intensity of the mushroom heads in turn highlights once again the thermodynamic relationship between light and electricity. The more electric energy is yet employed for growth, the more energy is converted from electricity into light. And hence, the younger mushrooms shine way brighter than the older one. Bourgeois biotope. Finally, I'll dare a brief conclusion. Around 1900, electricity was not understood as an artificial man-made resource, but as a vital and driving force found in nature and drawn from it. The laws of thermodynamics and the related mutual convertibility of all forces and energies into one another seem to confirm this biological understanding. In Nancy, the artisans around Gallé integrated the technological components of the ultra-modern light bulbs into the visual program of their lamp designs, bringing the connotation of electric light with the invigorating forces of nature to the fore by almost naturalistic sculptural means. In contrast to the products of sculpture, the functional properties of the electric lamp also allowed the vital force of electricity, which was assumed to be present in nature, to actually act within these objects. Due to their electrification, the artistically designed plants appear to have literally grown from the ornately carved Art Nouveau tables. I'm showing you, for instance, a table with lamps by Louis Majorelle from 1903. Thus, the electric lamps of the École de Nancy must not only be accorded more importance in art history, but also substantially more meaning in the surrounding biomorphic Gesamtkunstwerke, that is, total works of art, that has hitherto been the case. Gallé's belated interest in the field of electric lamps and his decidedly pragmatic solutions at the 1900 World's Fair, where he occasionally placed light bulbs in pre-existing vase designs, have contributed their share to the niche existence of lamps to date. For the entire 19th century, yet especially for Art Nouveau and Jugendstil, the recreation of nature in private interiors was an essential paradigm. Guillaume has attested to both naturalist and symbolist art movements that they were concerned with the recontextualization of nature and revive nature created for a second time. Yet the original nature was identified above all with the flowing movement of living organisms. So could this artificial second nature be made visible more properly than in the shape of the electric force of nature, which can be essentially experienced as light and heat. Vases, services, cane handles, and fauteuils, on their part, picked up a distinct moment from nature's repertoire that was as close to life as possible, captured it, and made it tangible. In the lamps, however, the galvanic élan vital actually ran. Thus, an almost energetic, causative relationship can be ascertained between the lamps and the nature-shaped interior. In a way, it is only through the living lamps that the total work of art and the interiors came to life. Particularly from the evening hours onwards, the luminous properties breathed life into the surrounding biomorphic objects, which would otherwise have disappeared in the dark for many hours. However, I'd like to add one final closing remark. In recent years, the manifold vivification strategies around the turn of the century have been heavily strained on the part of an artistry intent on image activity. As far as electric lamps are concerned, one cannot ignore the deliberate ruptures with the imputed pan-animism of these objects. First of all, this floral nature is not genuinely autonomous, but requires an externalized, so to speak, illuminating activation of the switch. The fact that pronounced non-naturalistic materials, such as gilded bronzes, have repeatedly been chosen for organic forms, simultaneously reveals the objects as synthetic artifacts and cultural products. It is not so much the sheer vivacity that makes the lamp so appealing, but the subtle suspense between high-quality luxury article and animated natural derivative. Given that the vital force of nature actually did stream through the lamps, they were rendered all the more attractive objects. Even more so only if there had existed one in the shape of a spectacular, electrified allegory of nature from Alfons Mucha's hand. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Thomas, for that really fantastic and enlightening talk.